Poland is a country of enormous strategic importance, both for the EU and for NATO. It is one of the largest and most populous countries on the European continent, with the ambition of building the strongest standing army in the EU by the end of the decade. It has also provided substantial amounts of military aid to neighboring Ukraine, which has been facing a brutal war of aggression unleashed by Russia. As such, it comes as no surprise that any election in Poland that could have the potential to alter the course of the country's domestic and foreign policy attracts significant attention, both from the country's allies as well as from its foes. And now, it seems very likely that there could be a seismic shift on the horizon for Poland. What awaits the country by 2027? Let's find out. I'm Jan with Prague Pulse, and this is the story of how the result of the 2023 Polish general election might transform Poland in the future, and what that could mean for Europe. In October of this year, Poland held a general election. Some analysts have labeled it the most consequential election for Europe in 2023. The right-wing populist Law and Justice Party, the PiS for short, campaigned to win an unprecedented third consecutive term. The main opposition to the PiS has been the Civic Coalition, led by former Polish Prime Minister and President of the European Council, Donald Tusk. In the end, the governing PiS did manage to win the election, garnering more than 35% of the vote and a total of 194 seats in the Polish Sejm. However, there is a massive catch. Most likely, despite the win on paper, the party will be unable to hold a majority in the 460-seat lower chamber of the Polish parliament. All the other parties that have made it into the Sejm have either ruled out a coalition with the PiS outright or are too weak to make a difference anyway. At the time of recording, negotiations about the future Polish government are still ongoing and might take several weeks, if not months. But it is safe to say that after 8 years, the era of the PiS is coming to an end. Both the New Left Party and the center-right Third Way have already announced their willingness to form a coalition government led by Tusk's Civic Coalition. So the key question is, how exactly will Poland change if there is indeed a change in leadership? Let's take a look. Since it took power in 2015, the PiS government has run a highly nationalist and populist agenda, justifying it by saying it would rid the country of the vestiges of its communist past, make it more secure and protect Poland's traditional Catholic values. However, was that really what the PiS wanted to achieve, or was there something much more nefarious going on? Critics claim the party has gradually dismantled many checks and balances that are essential for democracy's survival. It has compromised the independence of Polish courts by making sure that the selection of new judges is now entirely controlled by the government. That effectively means that the entire judicial system is very vulnerable to political interference, which is a significant departure from international standards and the protection of democracy and the rule of law. To make matters even worse, the PiS had also introduced a highly controversial disciplinary system for judges. Using arbitrary rules, the PiS government can now punish judges simply because it does not like their rulings and basically bully them into submission. This all led the European Commission to conclude that the rule of law situation in Poland had seriously deteriorated. The prospective new government led by Tusk campaigned on a much more liberal platform. It has already announced that it would do away with the damage the PiS is said to have caused to Poland. That, however, will not be easy. You see, the problem for any new Polish government not led by the PiS could well be the Polish president, Andrzej Duda. For one, he himself is a former PiS party member. As such, he has historically had very close ties with the party. Between 2011 and 2014, he was even a member of the Sejm for the PiS, and in 2015, he was elected president as the party's official candidate. While now officially independent as president, it is safe to assume that Duda would still be skeptical about any undoing of PiS policies, however controversial that might be. It doesn't end there though. In Poland, the president is actually quite powerful and can substantially complicate the lives of the government. If he opposes a law, he can veto it. But then the government needs not just a simple majority of votes to force the law through. The government would need the so-called supermajority of 3/5 of the votes in the Sejm to overturn the veto. And the problem? Well, the new government definitely would not have that many votes. That leaves the new government with two options. Either they must try to find a common ground with the president, or they will need to significantly trim down their reform ambitions to avoid confrontation. Most likely, the result will be a combination of the two. Needless to say, Poland's allies are not too happy with the erosion of the country's democracy. The European Commission, for its part, has refused to pay a total of 36 billion euros to Poland. That is money in the form of loans and grants from the EU's pandemic recovery tool. Plus, another 75 billion euros from the EU's cohesion funds is also at risk of being frozen. So a lot of money is at stake here. Actually, withholding funding is one of the very few tools the EU has to enforce the fundamental rights of democracy and the rule of law. I explained this in much more detail in a previous video. You should see the card up on the screen. Be sure to check it out. It's not just about money though. During the campaign, the PIS used a staunchly anti-EU and anti-German rhetoric, labeling Tusk a German agent and indirectly calling Germany Poland's executioner. On the international stage, the PIS has routinely used the threat of vetoing important EU legislation to get its own way, earning it the reputation of a troublemaker. As you can imagine, fixing the Polish-EU relations under such conditions will hardly be a walk in the park. Then again, Tusk is a former president of the European Council. As such, he knows his way around the intricacies of Brussels politics, and he shouldn't find it all too difficult. Indeed, he has already made unblocking the money from EU funds a priority. He also pledged Poland would once again play a central constructive role in the EU. Leaks from the Civic Coalition indicate that Tusk will set out on this mission even before formally becoming PM. He could travel to Brussels as early as late October to meet with allies. Without going into too much detail, let's just say that Poland has always had quite restrictive abortion laws. All the way in 1993, under heavy influence of the Catholic Church, it passed the so-called Family Planning Act, also called the Abortion Compromise. It only allowed abortions under three circumstances: when the woman's life was in danger, when there was a high probability of a severe impairment of the fetus, or if the pregnancy resulted from a criminal act. This law remained in force all the way until 2020, when the PIS-controlled Constitutional Court ruled that allowing abortions on the grounds of fetal damage was illegal. According to estimates by the UN, approximately 98% of all abortions in Poland had been carried out for that specific reason. The decision of the Constitutional Court led to waves of protests and international condemnations. Tusk now promises to liberalize abortion access and allow abortions up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. However promising that may sound, any change to Poland's abortion laws will most likely be very difficult to pass. For one, President Duda can use his veto, and chances are he would in this case, given how conservative his party heritage is. And then, not even Tusk's own party, itself a broad coalition of diverse interests, fully supports the plan. And the same applies to his future coalition partners, some of which have already voiced anti-abortion stances in the past. Tusk also needs to consider the Polish electorate. It is true that the 2020 Constitutional Court ruling caused massive protests, yes. According to polls, a whopping 97% of Civic Coalition voters do want to see liberalized access to abortions. However, a recent poll also found that only around 56% of the population would favor returning to the pre-2020 abortion regulation, which was still quite restrictive in the first place, while only 30% favor liberalizing abortion laws more. So, Poland does remain deeply torn, with the division between the more liberal west of the country and the conservative east still clearly visible. The recent election has hardly changed anything in that respect. But there's also a different view. Yes, Poland does remain divided on the issue of abortions, and the influence of the Catholic Church does remain high. That may explain why the major parties were historically reluctant to make women's rights their priority. Besides, Tusk himself largely ignored the issue of abortion access when he was prime minister between 2007 and 2015. However, the country is changing and the influence of the church seems to be waning. The share of active churchgoers, as well as Catholics in general, has been falling all over the country, with the decline being especially pronounced among young voters. So time may be ripe for increasing the protections of women's rights, but it definitely will not be an easy feat. Many hurdles lie ahead. Independent media are a key component of any democracy. They should ideally provide an unbiased coverage of politics so as to allow the voter to freely and fairly decide in an election. However, the PiS government has severely compromised independent media in Poland. While still officially independent of the government on paper, the PiS started interfering in the media shortly after gaining power in 2015. Within weeks, it dismissed its board and senior management and replaced it with party loyalists. The result? The government now enjoys over 80% of coverage, and only the remaining 20% concerns the opposition. And when it does, the coverage is largely negative. Actually, the lack of objectivity in Polish state-controlled media sometimes goes to pretty absurd lengths. Recently, the state-controlled TV channel TVP has even cut away from an interview with the opposition to broadcast footage of the PiS Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki eating a cake. The PiS also uses the threat to revoke a broadcasting license to force private media into submission and limits their access to advertising. While many people get their news from independent internet sources, the state-controlled TVP evening news program is still watched by around 2 million people every single day, especially in PiS heartlands, so its influence remains significant. Tusk has promised he would swiftly restore the independence of the media when he comes to power. While likely easier than pushing through an abortion reform, some pushback from the president, TVP employees, or the PiS-controlled judiciary cannot be ruled out and is to be expected, especially if a change in legislation is necessary. Ultimately, Poland will undergo a transformation. It will likely regain a much more positive view of the EU and might even become a significant driving force behind its future reform. If you want to see how that might look, be sure to check out our episode where we explain what exactly might happen. Then again, many of the ambitions that the incoming government has will hit roadblocks that the PiS had set up. Whether Donald Tusk manages to fulfill his ambitious promises and bring Poland back from the precipice of authoritarianism remains to be seen. But the recent election result is, at the very least, a reason for careful optimism.